My name is Shannon Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of Lincoln County Historical Association, co-hosting this lecture tonight with Bob Ives, who's representing our friends at Old Bristol Historical Society. Welcome. We're so glad to see such a wonderful turnout tonight. Last summer at Lincoln County Historical, we took down what was an extremely interesting and popular exhibit that ran for 2 years on the women writers of Lincoln County. Among those dozens of incredible, talented women writers who have called our county home was the influential and well-known Rachel Carson. We had this quote on the wall of the exhibit that I loved. It said, "The number of books that have done as much good in the world can be counted on the arms of a starfish." And that was about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. I thought that was a beautiful quote. Although that exhibit is now put away, our interest in sharing the stories of these women writers of our area is still very strong, and I'm very excited to be finally bringing this opportunity to learn more about Carson here tonight with Barbara Vickery. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank our series sponsor, J. Edward Knight and Company Insurance. We are able to offer this lecture free to the public thanks to their support. I mentioned that we're hosting, Lincoln County Historical Association is hosting this lecture together with Old Bristol Historical Society. We're very excited about this collaborative effort. Both of our organizations are membership-based. We both have dedicated rosters of volunteers helping us preserve and interpret the history of our region. LCHA operates not only a successful education program that works with area schools, but we have 3 historic building museums. And OBHS also offers programs, lectures year-round, and they're currently working on the restoration of a historic mill that will open to the public as a mill museum this summer. I'm looking forward to checking it out. I'm pausing to let some more folks in from the waiting room. Both LCHA and OBHS can work towards our missions because of donations from our community. And tonight I do ask you to consider a donation of any amount to one or both of our nonprofits. This will help us continue the work we're so proud to be doing. We both accept donations online and checks by mail. And the reason I said small is that I wanted to make a point to say a small donation makes a difference. If everybody here donated, $1, that would make a difference. $5 would be incredible. $20 would be staggering. Of course, that's not where it ends. The ceiling continues. In any case, we both do accept donations online and by mail. Information to donate is available on both of our websites, lincolncountyhistory.org and oldbristolhistoricalsociety.org. Both of our organizations have other events coming up. For Lincoln County Historical, we have a talk called Good Grit, Black Sailors of Lincoln County, coming up on February 22nd with our trustee, Corey Tanzer. And OBHS is currently finalizing a schedule of upcoming talks. I've had a little bit of a sneak peek at that, and I can say with certainty that we have some good programs coming up. Do keep an eye out for those announcements. And before I move on, I do have a little bit of housekeeping to cover. For tonight's talk, please remain muted throughout so that we don't have distractions of hearing background noise. We will save time for questions and answers at the end. And the way to submit your questions is in the chat, which you should be able to find a little speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, then you should be able to write a note to me in the chat. To me, or you can write it to the whole group. And what will happen is I will read that out to Barbara at the end of the talk. Yes, the lecture is being recorded, and if all goes well, I hope to upload it to YouTube probably early next week, I'm guessing. I think that's enough for me. I've gotten all the boring stuff out of the way, and now I'm going to turn it over to Bob Ives of Old Bristol Historical Society. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Shannon, so much. So I'd like to welcome each and every one of you this evening, and on behalf of myself, Bob Ives of the Old Bristol Historical Society, and on behalf of Shannon Gilmore of the Lincoln County Historical Association, it's such a great pleasure and joy to share together in this evening talk on Rachel Carson by our speaker, Barbara St. John Vickery. Barbara has lived a rather remarkable life. She was born in Bath, Maine, and has been in Maine pretty much her entire life. She attended the George School in Pennsylvania, Harvard University, and then on to Connecticut College, where she met her husband, Peter Vickery. In 1983, she joined the staff of the Nature Conservancy of Maine as Director of Science and Stewardship, and then later served as Director of Conservation Programming until her retirement in 2017. After her husband's death, she worked with a team to edit his life's work, a book entitled Birds of Maine, which was published in 2020. Barbara continues to serve on the Maine Board of Environmental Protection and the Maine Board of the Forest Society. She is an active member in Citizens Climate Lobby in Midcoast, Maine, and is also a member of 6 local environmental organizations. Upon her retirement in 2017, Maine Coast Heritage Trust named Barbara the recipient of the SB Heritage Award for her outstanding and exemplary conservation efforts throughout all of Maine. So will you join with me now in giving Barbara a warm welcome as we look forward to her talk on the esteemed author and writer and person, Rachel Carson.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. And just one correction.
Sure.
I met Peter at George School, which is important because we had been sweethearts since we were 16 years old.
Oh,
When Sharon asked me to give a talk about Rachel Carson, I was enormously honored because I've always been an admirer. When I would be asked who were my heroes, I would often ponder a long time and try to think, heroes, who were my heroes? And then I would say Rachel Carson. But I was also humbled because I thought I can't do her justice because I don't actually know much about her. My third thought was that I wanted to know her better, and what better way to get to know her than to do the homework needed to share something about her with all of you. I had questions about how this woman, who had no PhD, no platform of university or government position or national organization from which to speak, had so much influence. And further, as her photos seem to show, she was a retiring, modest person. So how did she become the lightning rod of national scientific debates and the essential spark for the environmental movement? How I had known her best was as a conservationist. I spent most of my professional career working for the Maine chapter of the Nature Conservancy, of which Rachel Carson was a founding member. As she said to a group that gathered at the Wiscasset Inn in 1956, to share their concerns about what was happening to the Maine coast. What about the Nature Conservancy? It's the only group I know which is doing something practical about actually preserving areas. She became the founding chair of this new chapter, only the 4th such in the country, and remained honorary chair until her death. When I started at the Conservancy, responsible for taking care of some 75 preserves around the state, many of these were along the coast. All of the coastal work of my program was financially supported by TNC's Rachel Carson Endowment, funded with the proceeds of Miss Carson's books, which she had left to the Conservancy in her will. So I knew she was a successful author of multiple books that were still selling after many decades, as the royalties continued to accrue to that endowment fund. And specifically, I knew a place she had spent time for it was one of the preserves in my care, the Rachel Carson Salt Pond in Chamberlain. I hope you know it and that you have gone at low tide to when you can enjoy close looks at starfish and limpets and dulse and Irish moss. The third way I knew about Rachel Carson had everything to do with bald eagles. The story of the comeback of eagles on the Maine coast after DDT was banned was iconic in the annals of conservation. TNC, when I began there in 1983, was focused on helping IF&W bring back Maine's eagle population by protecting islands with nesting pairs, and soon was responsible for protecting a dozen such islands. That comeback was made possible, I knew, because Rachel Carson's book had led to the banning of DDT. So that's what I knew. So I set out to learn more. I learned the basic facts of her life. She grew up poor in Springdale, Pennsylvania, steel and coal country outside Pittsburgh, but on a small farm with a woodlot where she spent a lot of time with her mother, who encouraged Rachel's natural instinct to observe closely, be curious, and enjoy the natural world. Rachel later wrote this, and it is clear for her that special someone was her mother. And when she was an adult, she did her best to be that person for young people. She went to the Pennsylvania College for Women, intending to major in English because she had always known she wanted to be a writer. But a general distribution requirement led her to take a course in biology from a gifted teacher. She was hooked, and she suddenly realized this is what she wanted to write about, and switched her major to biology. In 1929, she started a graduate program in marine biology at Johns Hopkins on a full scholarship. She had no experience of the sea growing up, but was always drawn to it. She loved the summers at Woods Hole that were part of that graduate work. She would have liked to have gone on to pursue a PhD, but by this time it was the depths of the Depression, and she needed a steady job to help support her mother, her sister, and 2 nieces. In 1936, she got a job as a biologist with the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, which eventually was folded into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She started by writing a series of radio programs on marine life and creating pamphlets on ocean fish to encourage housewives to branch out in what seafood they offered their families. She moved on to conservation bulletins for each region and a series called Conservation in Action about the refuges. But in a decade, she had gone from junior aquatic biologist to chief editor of all of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service publications, which meant general director of the publishing program with a staff of 6 assistants, and was the ghostwriter for speeches and congressional testimony given by department officials. A fellow writer meeting her for the first time in this period described her as quiet, diffident, neat, and without any affectation. It is good to read from people who knew her then that besides being an exacting editor, she was fun to be with, laughed with her office mates, and built friendships as she got opportunities to explore more of the Atlantic coast. One who was able to spend time in the field with her wrote, "We learned a great deal from her, most of all, a way of seeing, alert to every impression, with keen delight in all manner of small creatures, as well as the vast horizons and far reaches." Meanwhile, she was still publishing her own work in magazine articles, which eventually led to invitations from publishers for full-length books about the sea. I'm sorry that when we drew the outline of what you all should be seeing, it was not shaped for every slide. Never mind. An essential way of getting to know Rachel Carson is through her own words, especially her books. I started with her first, Under the Sea Wind, which was not an instant success when published, but her favorite, and now mine. In fact, I just was reading before we got on tonight in the last letters to Dorothy, whom you'll hear about in a minute. She said that when she was sleeping at night, she picked up Under the Sea Wind to help her fall asleep. And I thought that was sweet. It is a lovely book to go to bed with. What is different about this book as a piece of nature writing is that she doesn't so much tell us that eels migrate downstream in the fall, or even invite us to observe adult eels migrating from fresh water to the sea. She takes us into the water and invites those creatures, in effect, to tell us what they are seeing, sensing, and feeling. And thus, we readers not only learn a lot about their life stories and habitats that we've not only never seen, but rarely imagined, but we feel a connection and empathy with lives very different from our own. That empathy and sense of connection to all life is an essential through line in all of Rachel Carson's work and message. Her later books, no less imaginative, rely more on direct observations, as well as meticulous library research. They continue to emphasize connections between species and habitats. The next book was far more successful. The Sea Around Us was on the bestseller list for 86 weeks. Some people were surprised at the popularity of a work of science. Oh, shucks, I'll have to read this because you can't see all of it. Ms. Carson challenged the idea that science was something apart or that science writing must be without poetry. The materials of science are the materials of life itself, she said. The aim of science is to discover and illuminate the truth, and that, I take it, is the aim of literature. My purpose is to portray the sea with fidelity and understanding. I was writing as the subject demanded. The winds, the sea, and the moving tides are what they are. If there is wonder, beauty, and majesty in them, science will discover those qualities. If there is poetry in my book about the sea, it is not because I deliberately put it there, but because no one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry. With the publication of The Sea Around Us, Rachel Carson became famous and had what today would be called a huge fan base. She was in demand for magazine articles for Ladies' Home Journal and Atlantic, and her books were condensed as Reader's Digest offered his Book of the Month Club selections, translated into 37 languages. There was even a documentary movie made of The Sea Around Us. She was gaining influence with lay people, non-scientists, and she began realizing that this gave her a platform she should use not only to teach, but to preach. She won numerous awards, including the John Burroughs Award. Upon accepting the award, she said, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for its destruction of our race. Wonder and humility do not exist side by side with a lust for destruction." Importantly, the financial success of The Sea Around Us is what allowed Rachel Carson to quit her job with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and devote herself full-time to her writing. It also allowed her to purchase a small plot of land in Southport on the shores of Sheepscot Bay, where she built a cottage that was to become her favorite place to be. She brought her mother, her niece Marjorie, her sister having since died, and grandnephew Roger there each summer. The sea was yards from her doorstep. She could hear the tide coming in and going out through one window, and hermit thrushes and warblers in the spruce woods behind her through another. A side benefit of this new summer home in Southport was that it introduced her to Stanley and Dorothy Freeman, who had a summer cottage nearby. Dorothy wrote to Rachel, welcoming her and suggesting they meet. They formed an instant rapport. Dorothy and Stanley also loved exploring intertidal life, and Stanley was an excellent photographer whose photos of the intertidal creatures Rachel would use in her presentations, such as to the Lincoln County Cultural and Historic Association, to give a benefit lecture at the jail in Wisconsin. Dorothy became Rachel's closest friend and an essential support through Rachel's health issues and the uproar around Silent Spring. What Rachel especially treasured, she said in a letter, was that Dorothy alone among all her friends understood both her writing life and its trials and the rest of her life. Her next book, The Edge of the Sea, in which she drew some of the most evocative passages from the tide pools at the Salt Pond and out her own door in Southport, was an equal success. And if my voice will stand it, I'm going to read you a little piece of it that I think gives a flavor. As I lie and look into the pool, there are moments of relative quiet in the intervals when one wave has receded and the next has not yet entered. Oh, excuse me, I should frame this. She's looking into a cave that is only accessible at very low tide. Then I can hear the small sounds, the sound of water dripping from the mussels on the ceiling, or of water dripping from seaweeds that line the walls, small silver splashes losing themselves in the vastness of the pool, and in the confused, murmurous whisperings that emanate from the pool itself, the pool that is never quite still. Then, as my fingers explore among the dark red thongs of the dulse and push away the fronds of the Irish moss that cover the walls beneath me, I begin to find creatures of such extreme delicacy that I wonder how they can exist in this cave when the brute force of storm surf is unleashed within its confined space. Well, you get the idea. She's a heck of a writer. I hope that makes you run out to your library to get that book. She had ideas about, sorry, I missed, lost my place. She had ideas about what she wanted to write next, a vast, comprehensive book on the relation of life to the physical environment, tentative title, Man and Nature. For sure, she wanted to emphasize that all life is interrelated. But about this time, she got a letter from a woman describing the death of many songbirds following a spray of DDT over a nature preserve in a rural neighborhood. 7 robins dead in the letter writer's yard. All bees and grasshoppers gone, but mosquitoes as voracious as ever, and begging Rachel to find someone in Washington to help. This was not an isolated incident. There were numerous such anecdotal reports, but this was a personal appeal. Carson felt that something had to be done. Someone needed to pull together the data and tell the world. She urged others to take it on. She begged E.B. White, fellow Maine writer and editor of the New Yorker, to write it. He said, no, you need to write this book, and we will publish it in serial form, as they had done with Sea Around Us. Rachel Carson didn't want to write that book. She wanted to write about life in all its wondrous forms. She knew it would be a book about death. She referred to it as the poison book, but she felt she had to do something. And so she started in. She signed a contract for the book in 1958, estimating she would complete it in 7 months, but it soon became evident it was going to take much longer. For one thing, she knew it would be controversial, and so she was determined to make sure the science was ironclad. In addition, the more experts she consulted from around the world, the more evidence she was finding of the impacts of DDT and other pesticides on other insects besides mosquitoes, on fish, on birds, on people. But then each new story needed to be fleshed out and painstakingly fact-checked. It wasn't that no one had documented issues with DDT or other pesticides before, but no one had pulled together widely scattered facts and considered them in the context of each other. The other reason it took so long was that she suffered personal tragedy, the death of her mother and niece, which led to the adoption and care of her grandnephew, Roger, and the return of metastasizing breast cancer, a series of infections, and a crippling flare-up of arthritis. And there was the challenge of writing something people would actually pay attention to. It's a great problem to know how to penetrate the barrier of public indifference and unpleasant facts that might have to be dealt with if one recognized their existence. But knowing what I do, I have no choice but to set it down to be read by those who will. The fact that more than 2 million copies of Silent Spring sold and it sparked a generation of activists suggests that she had penetrated the barrier of indifference. I had never read Silent Spring and frankly dreaded doing so for this talk, for the same reasons Rachel didn't want to write it. It's much more enjoyable to read her lyrical accounts of life on the sea and its shores, but I found it to be highly readable and suddenly realized why it was a bestseller, despite its grim topic. She's an extraordinary explainer of science for laypeople. There's the satisfaction of understanding. I was taken, for instance, with her explanation of mitochondria. The enduring, persistent impulse of life is dependent on intricate workings of energy generation in tiny parts of every cell, the mitochondria, which have been in living cells since the beginning of life. I remember being cajoled, encouraged, instructed to memorize the Krebs cycle when I was in biology in high school. And I found it very challenging. It didn't stick with me. I don't remember it. But here's what I do remember, that Rachel Carson made clear. It is a cycle. And each one is dependent on a specific enzyme. And those are the numbered aces going around the thing. And if there is something that disrupts one of those, it stops the whole cycle, no energy for any living things. Well, the point she was making was that chemicals introduced, never known to life forms before, invented by humans, often altered those enzymes. Read the book. She explains it better than I do. She tells the story of the dramatic decline of bald eagles on the Gulf Coast, mirroring the Gulf of Maine decline, but also of Clear Lake in California, where spraying to eliminate harmless but annoying gnats led to the elimination of nesting grebes, who had eaten fish, which had eaten aquatic bugs, which had eaten plankton, all of which were packed with high concentrations of DDT, even after the water itself seemed to have no DDT left in it. I looked it up. I wanted to make sure that grebes are back in that lake, and they are. She also told the sad story of Midwestern towns trying to save their elms dying of Dutch elm disease by spraying DDT to kill the insects transmitting the fungal disease, only to find dead robins littering lawns the following spring. Robins that had eaten worms, that had eaten fallen elm leaves, that had been sprayed the year before. Her stories vividly drive home the crucial lessons of ecosystem-wide effects via bioaccumulation, the pernicious power of small doses accumulating over time and flowing through complex food webs. Carson also regularly used the subtle but lethal impacts of radiation from nuclear material as an analogy to chemicals, knowing the public in 1960 was now all too aware of this danger. The other reason Silent Spring is not such grim reading is that at each turn she offers alternatives, describing, for instance, how towns in New York had saved many of their elms, not through spraying pesticides, but by rigorous forest hygiene, picking up and removing all the diseased wood and preventing further spread of the blight from tree to tree. All the more compelling since insecticides were not working anyway. When the book was finally completed and she had gotten a positive reaction from the New Yorker editor, she wrote to Dorothy, and suddenly the tension of the last 4 years was broken and I let the tears come. I said last summer that I could never again listen happily to a thrush song if I had not done all I could. And last night the thought of all the birds and other creatures and all the liveliness that is in nature came to me with such a surge of deep happiness that now I have done what I could. I had been able to complete it, and now it had its own life. When it was finally on its way to publication, but had yet to come out in the advanced New Yorker series, 3 chemical companies threatened to sue the publisher if the book were published, saying that Carson was in league with sinister anti-American parties, in those days code for communist. When the suit was dropped as groundless, they mounted a concerted media campaign. There was concern expressed that the attack on DDT, sorry about that, would lead to widespread deaths in Africa where it was used effectively to control mosquitoes carrying malaria. In fact, she didn't ever propose a ban on DDT. DDT had been developed for use against malaria-carrying mosquitoes during the war. It had never been imagined for, let alone tested for safety, for use in broadcast applications in suburbia or in large-scale agriculture. The criticisms drew on widespread prejudice against women scientists. The Time magazine review said that Carson's emotional and accurate, note that, outburst was hysterically emphatic. When she was preparing to speak to a local community group organizing against spraying in their neighborhood, one of the town fathers called to tell her she was an alarmist. And when she started citing case histories, he said, "You really must not believe everything you read in the newspapers." She was furious. She wasn't a PhD, but she was a scientist who relied on fact. No one seeing her response that afternoon could have called her gentle, a friend wrote. But her anger was not about her ego. It was about her desperate desire to penetrate that barrier of indifference. She had become an unabashed advocate, a crusader. Silent Spring represented a threat not only to the pesticides industry, representing a small but wealthy group of companies, but also the prevalent societal attitude that nature was something that had to be dominated and controlled by humans. She felt we should control ourselves. In any case, the science was sound. Rachel Carson had earned the trust of her raters, and people, housewives, local citizen groups were concerned. Thousands of people wrote letters to her, to the editors of their papers, to their political representatives. Part of the awakening was not just that pesticides were pervasive and pernicious, but the realization that an essential unspoken trust had been broken. The assumption that someone was making sure they were safe before allowing their use without people's knowledge or permission. But she posed the questions, who is making those decisions? Who gets to decide between crops and monarchs? Who has the right to invade my property, with poisons without my permission or knowledge? That lost innocence and its consequence, the realization that people have to take personal responsibility for finding out and paying attention and demanding action, was part of what then sparked the environmental movement. A year after the publication, a massive fish kill in the Mississippi was confirmed to be linked to a major stockpile of pesticides on the banks of the river. The public took notice and connected the dots. She was interviewed on CBS Sunday Morning by Eric Sevareid. It was set up as a kind of debate, and the consensus was Rachel Carson won. Some people have told me that when they see this photo, they notice that her hair looks different. That is because Rachel Carson was undergoing treatment for cancer this whole time, and she had lost her hair. That's a wig. She and Dorothy called it the Betty. President Kennedy directed his President's Science Advisory Council to take up the questions raised by the book, and in 1963, they issued their report, essentially validating Rachel Carson's findings. The day after the report came out, Connecticut's Senator Ribicoff began hearings by the Senate Committee on Environmental Hazards, and Rachel came to testify. Her health, which seemed to have been on a bit of a rebound, such that she thought in February that she might get back to her beloved cottage in Southport, declined rapidly. She died April 14th, 1964, at age 56. She packed a lot into those last years. We might have thought that once Silent Spring's truth was validated by a presidential council, she seemed to have won the battle in the press, and Congress was looking at the issues, that things would change quickly. But it was a slow process. It's hard for us to realize now DDT had been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. There was no EPA. There was no Clean Air Act, no Clean Water Act, no concept of endangered species, let alone their protection by the federal government. All these things had to be imagined, coalitions built, legislation designed, legislators persuaded, and eventually they were. It took many people and organizations, but there's no question Rachel Carson's messages prepared the way for that movement. All her books helped everyone understand the concepts of ecology, the interconnections among all living things. And Silent Spring in particular galvanized an environmental conscience and action. And birds like bald eagles and peregrine falcons responded to the ban of DDT. That bald eagles went from a few dozen pairs in Maine in the 1970s to now more than 800 pairs around the state is a wonderful, shining environmental success story that I enjoy every day. But there is still work to be done. Take in some of those facts. In a speech to students at Scripps the year before she died, she said, "I used to wonder whether nature actually needed protection from man. Surely the sea was inviolate and forever beyond man's power to change it. Surely the vast cycles by which water is drawn up into the clouds to return again to the earth could never be touched. And just as surely the vast tides of life, the migrating birds, would continue to ebb and flow over the continents, marking the passage of the seasons. But I was wrong. Even these things that seem to belong to the eternal verities are not only threatened, but have already felt the destroying hand of man. I wish I could stand before you and say that my own generation had brought strength and meaning to man's relation to nature, that we had looked upon the majesty, beauty, and terror of the earth we inhabit and learned wisdom and humility. Also, alas, this cannot be said. For it is we who have brought into being fateful and destructive powers. But the stream of time moves forward. Your generation must come to terms with the environment, she said to the graduating class. Your generation must face realities instead of taking refuge in ignorance and evasion of truth. Yours is a grave and sobering responsibility, but also a shining opportunity. You go out into a world where mankind is challenged, as it has never been challenged before, to prove its maturity and its mastery, not of nature, but of itself. Proving our maturity and mastery over ourselves, as Rachel Carson challenged us, whether it be curbing the chemicals we use and put into our lands and waters, or radically reducing the carbon dioxide we add to the atmosphere to avoid catastrophic climate impacts, is going to be very, very hard work and often discouraging. So I want to leave you with some of Rachel Carson's more hopeful reminders, the things that can give us strength to carry on these struggles. And I want to end, I think I have time, Shannon, to share a letter Rachel Carson wrote to Dorothy about 6 months before she died.
Yes, you have time. Yes.
Dorothy and Rachel had gone out to Newhaven, and she described in her letter later to Dorothy what their day had been like. This is a postscript to our morning at Newhaven, something I think I can write better than say. For me, it was one of the loveliest of the summer's hours, and all the detail will remain in my memory. That blue September sky, the sounds of wind in the spruces and surf on the rocks, the gulls busy with their foraging, alighting with deliberate grace, the distant views of Griffith's Head and Todd Point, today so clearly etched, though once seen in swirling fog. But most of all, I shall remember the monarchs, that unhurried drift of one small winged form after another, each drawn by some invisible force. We talked a little about their life history. Did they return? We thought not. For most, at least, this was the closing journey of their lives. But it occurred to me this afternoon, remembering that it had been a happy spectacle, that we had felt no sadness when we spoke of the fact that there would be no return. And rightly, for when any living thing has come to the end of its cycle, we accept the end is natural. For the monarch butterfly, the cycle is measured in a known span of months. For ourselves, the measure is something else, the span of which we cannot know. But the thought is the same. When that intangible cycle has run its course, it is a natural and not unhappy thing that a life comes to its end. This is what those brightly fluttering bits of life taught me this morning. I found a deep happiness in it. So I hope make you. Thank you for this morning.
Barbara, thank you. Is that the conclusion of your talk?
That is the conclusion of my talk. The only thing I have left is to let people know some resources if they are interested in learning more, besides reading Rachel Carson's own books, of course. I drew heavily on the House of Paul Brooks's biography. It's not exactly a biography. The House of Life, Rachel Carson at Work. Paul had been her agent, sort of, and editor, and He also was the person, he and his wife were the people who adopted Roger when Rachel died. And then there is Always Rachel, the letters of Rachel Carson and Dorothy Freeman, edited by Martha Freeman of Maine, which is a quite remarkable thing. And then finally, A Sense of Wonder, which is a one-woman play about Rachel Carson, written and performed by Kailani Lee. Best, that's supposed to say best, in live performance, but available as a video documentary online.